Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, Mr. John Roberts, to our university. It's a very interesting debate about the Black Sea security energy area. And before we come here, I discussed more than 40 minutes with Mr. Roberts, and we discussed about some important countries neighbor with us: Russian, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, neighbor not so far from us, 2 hours, 3 hours by plane. And the talk today about energy security, Black Sea, will be very interesting for us, but I'm sure for our students. I'm so glad to see a huge number of my students from the master's programs. I'm so glad to see my colleagues from my departments of public management, the management of the faculty, of course, our partner from ROEC. This event, it's important because show our strong partnership with ROEC, with Eugenia Kushilov, former Fulbright scholarship in Columbia University, I don't know how many years ago. And today the talk will be very interesting, not only for us, also for the specialists for this energy sector. And we hope to have more research projects in this area of energy in our university. Thank you again, Mr. Roberts. Welcome again to our university. And now I invite Eugenia to introduce you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Eugenia Gusilov. I'm the director, for those of you who don't know me, of the think tank Romania Energy Center. And I'm very glad to see familiar faces in the audience, but also new faces. And we have a very diverse audience this evening, in the sense that we have diplomats present here, professors, think tank analysts, students, of course. Thank you for coming. Seasoned energy experts, journalists, and consultants. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, including our online viewers, because we are streaming live. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the new ROEC Bucharest Talks events. As always, before we begin, I have to say, a word of thanks to our partners. ASE, the Bucharest University of Economic Studies, Energy Industry Review, our media partners, Civitas Politics, Revista 22, and Impromedia. I want also to say that this is the third event in this series, and this time our focus is on energy security, and how this concept looks like in our region, the Black Sea. Our guest speaker is a veteran energy analyst who has written, reported, and analyzed energy developments and gas infrastructure projects for more years than I have lived. He has worked for prestigious media and energy publications like Platts, Reuters, Financial Times Energy, Energy Intelligence, Middle East Economic Digest, Business Monitor International, and Hayat, the Arab world's first independent daily newspaper. He is a member of the United Nations Economic Commission for Euro group of experts working on gas, and a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, Eurasia Center, and the Global Energy Center. John Roberts is also a member of the Labour Party, so for those of you who are interested to ask questions about Brexit, it could be a good occasion. It is also a great pleasure to introduce John Roberts this evening, not only because he is literally and honestly the best energy security expert that I have encountered in all my professional years of working as an energy analyst, but also because he's a friend. So thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
First of all, my thanks to the Romanian Energy Center for inviting me here. My thanks to all the sponsors who have helped organize and arrange this. And just to say one thing, it is such an honor to be in such a prestigious institution. here in Bucharest today. The only thing that I'm going to say at this stage about Brexit is I shouldn't be here at all. I should be back home seeing my country tearing itself to pieces. But we might perhaps deal with that towards the end of this session. I am going to start with breaking my talk into various sections, and I'll tell you what they are. The point about that is that when I come to the end of a section, I'm going to open it up for questions. Please confine your questions to the section that I've just covered, because you'll see why other sections will be coming up later on. And I also want to make sure that we have time at the end for a more general set of questions, including, I am warned, threatened, under sheer terror of my life that I have to answer concerning that word I'm not supposed to mention, Brexit. And the last point is, all of these slides will be made available to you. So you don't need to try to go and take photographs of them. You're perfectly welcome to have them. Now, let's see if I can work it out which way to go. Yep, that works. These are the basic sections I'm going to talk about. Energy security these days is more about gas than oil. Why? Very simply, oil, to use a word I learnt 40 or 50 years ago, is fungible. You can move it around, you can shift it very easily. You can do anything you want with it. If you can't get it out by any other form, you can carry it in a jerry can or put it on the back of a mule. You can't do that with gas. With gas, you need much more complicated infrastructure. You either have to have pipelines, or you have to have liquefied natural gas, or perhaps compressed natural gas. And whatever you do, basically, it costs very, very roughly twice as much to shift a unit of energy in the form of gas as to shift a unit of energy in the form of oil. So therefore, you have to think far more carefully about the need for long-term arrangements. I'll talk about energy security. I'll talk about the centrality of Russia. Obviously, I'm going to talk about pipeline projects in the region, the Southern Gas Corridor, Brewer, Turkish Stream. I'll talk a bit about the Caspian, a bit about Turkey, and a bit about the Eastern Mediterranean. Those are the sections. What constitutes energy security? There is no single definition. There are somewhere, at least in my archives, more than 60 different definitions. So these are just two sort of general approaches. I like the IEA one. Adequate, affordable, and reliable access to energy, fuels, and services. But there's a problem. The minute you start using adjectives like adequate, affordable, reliable, these are not objective words, they are subjective. They get defined in different ways according to whether you're a producer, a transit state, a consumer state, according to whether you're a developed country or a developing country, or somewhere in the middle. So no two countries will necessarily define these terms in the same way, even though they may be happy to sign up to them. And then you get the definition that came from Braxel-Kleber, the 5 S's. Resources such as fossil fuels, alternative energy, and renewable energy, sufficiency. Then you think of survivability. Think of sustainability. But again, every time you introduce these terms, they don't mean the same to everybody. One group's definition of sustainability is not going to be the same as another's. I will cite the example of the amount of resources that we have left. Back in 1948, in a book that got well received when it was published 3 years later, but more or less sank without trace, someone wrote, mankind has enough oil to last for 22 years, enough coal to last for 500 years, and enough damn silliness to last forever. The two first figures, 22 years for oil, said in 1948, that was what was then the estimate of the forerunner of the Economist Intelligence Unit. Not a silly statement. But even then, the concept was, are we looking wide enough? To which the answer was, we haven't begun to explore shallow offshore oil deposits. Move on 70 years, and we go 3,000 meters deep under the sea for some resources. Technology advances. Resources advance. Sustainability advances. Now note that I'm talking here about fossil fuels. Haven't even come on to the question of whether fossil fuels are sustainable in an environmental context, the damage that they can cause through the production of CO2, particulates in the air, the invisible smog that damages children's lungs. So all of these change the definitions of sustainable. And what's sustainable in a rural climate is not sustainable in a densely populated city. I'll do a little bit on oil. Energy security depends in part on the ability of importing countries to respond to oil supply disruptions. That, of course, was the lesson of the 1973 to 74 price hikes and the comparable price hikes that happened 78, 79 with the fall of the Shah. But is that a real long-term definition? It works for consumer countries. But what you really are trying to get is a common definition of energy security that groups producers, consumers, and transit states, the countries in between. That was what an energy security conference in St. Petersburg thought it had achieved in 2006. It hadn't, of course, because all it came up with was the idea that energy security had to be energy security for all three units, which is fine. No one's going to disagree with that. Doesn't tell you how you achieve that degree of security. So anyway, let's move on to the difference between oil and gas. As I said, one way or another, oil can get through. But gas is more complicated. And it's more complicated for one specific reason. If a big city gets cut off from gas because of some natural disaster, failure of a producer, heaven knows what, you can't simply turn the gas back on and expect everything to be back to normal once gas supplies are resumed. You have to check every single gas outlet, every single gas apparatus to check that everything's okay, that you're not going to get backfiring up the system. That takes time, costs money, months to get a system back up and running. Whereas if you cut off the oil, okay, I can't get petrol for my car. But I can put the car in the garage, and if I hear it's going to be out for a long time, I can even put the car on bricks so the tires don't get damaged. And when there's petrol again, a little bit of cleaning of the spark plugs, if you still have spark plugs, and the car can be back on the road again immediately. So that's why gas is a more complicated factor. And that's why it's interesting to see how much we're changing from pipeline gas to LNG. Why is that important? Because essentially, pipeline gas takes it from point A to point B, and traditionally, point A is where it gets produced, and point B is at least the start of where it gets consumed. Now we have vast distribution systems at the end. But essentially, you're still talking about the supply direct relationship between buyer and seller. But with LNG, the great thing about it is how is it transported? It's transported by sea, which means it doesn't have to flow along one particular pipeline to get to its destination. It can set off from America towards Europe, and if a day or two out of port, the owner of that particular cargo realizes he can sell it much better in a different destination, perhaps in Asia, you might get the tanker to ship round and go through Panama and head over to the Far East. It's more flexible. You can get LNG from Qatar, from Nigeria, from Algeria, from the United States, from Norway. Soon you're going to be able to get it from Russia. All of these come, in the past, have come to Britain. Sporadically, we have regular supply from Qatar, but we get them from other countries as well. And the same is true in Southern Europe. And it has one phenomenal advantage. Essentially, by definition, because it is resellable, it has to have a market price. Whereas pipeline gas is a bilateral affair. I won't bother with this at this stage, but I will come on to the centrality of Russia. This is a very old slide, but I love it. I love it for one reason, because it shows the absolute and extreme differences, sorry, I apologize for this, between the price of Russian gas in different markets. Why should Macedonia have to spend $564 for 1,000 cubic meters of gas? Why should Britain have to spend about 300 when others spend far less? And the answer is, quite simply, Macedonia has nowhere else to turn, not connected to anybody else, totally reliant on a single supplier. So therefore, that supplier, frankly, can screw them. Classic monopolistic practice. In this case, happens to be the Russians. But it does happen with other industries and other countries. Perfectly standard practice. So you want to work out ways to avoid this. But it's hard. There has traditionally been a very high dependence on Russian gas. And that dependence is set to grow. Why is it set to grow? Essentially, because it makes sense in the current energy transition. We face very, very serious problems connected with climate change and with the byproducts of pollution. It therefore makes sense to wish to decarbonize energy as much as possible. Logically, that of course would tell you, well, switch to renewables. The problem is that renewables, wind, solar, they're good. But they don't function all the time. Sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, wind doesn't blow. So what happens when you don't have, when it's nighttime or there's no wind? Or what happens when during the day there's so much wind that you're producing surplus energy or so much sunshine? We don't yet have the missing ingredient, which is cheap, large-scale battery storage. That's what people like Elon Musk are working on, but they haven't cracked the issue yet. And whether they will crack it in 1 year or whether they'll crack it in 10, I have no idea. When it comes, it'll probably sneak up on us and we'll suddenly find that they've done it without realizing it. But at the moment, it's not there. So you need backup. There's one obvious form of backup that people talk about, nuclear. Nuclear has problems, not least of which is a psychological distaste for reliance on nuclear power for all sorts of reasons. But the most obvious backup is gas. Why? Because the more you use gas, the easier it is to phase out the most polluting fuel of all, which is coal. It's the one that needs the least radical change in technology. So there should be a growing market for Russian gas, which is big enough as it is, and which should get even bigger over the next couple of years, and indeed should get even bigger as Europe has a greater demand for gas in the next decade or two, not least because indigenous European production, by which I mean Europe outside of Russia, is set to decline. It's already declining rapidly in the North Sea. And Norway, which is sort of at a plateau, but perhaps just starting to decline, is an important factor too. So what does Europe want to do? Ideally, it wants diversification. It's always the classic solution. What kind of diversification? The great advantage is that you can go geographically with LNG, and in particular, for the next few years at least, you can look to US LNG. Why? Because the wonderful thing about United States domestic energy politics is such that the logical source for LNG export platforms in the US is, of course, the Pacific coast, so that the gas can go from there to markets in Asia. You try building a liquefaction facility on the US Pacific coast, and you will have every environmentalist after you. So you have to build them in Texas or the south coast of the US, Gulf of Mexico, and ship it the long way around, either by Panama or Cape Horn. So therefore, Europe, much closer market, even though it's not so profitable, it's cheaper to ship it there. That's why Europe looks to the US as a really good long-term bet for gas supply. I think at this point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to take questions, because that's the basic gas position concerning why we rely on gas, why we're going to continue to rely on gas for a decade or two to come, and why Russian gas is going to be so important. So if you've got any questions so far, come out and say them. Oh, that's fine. That's okay. I'm happy. Yes, you have. Yes, there's a gentleman in the grey jersey. Can you shout, can you introduce yourself?
Yes,
too?
okay, thank you. My question for you is this. Here in Romania, when we talk about energy security, we often talk about energy independence. What is your view about the link between the two? Is there a need for one to be energy independent to have energy security? Thank you.
Gina, can you get the question repeated to me? Because I only got half of it. Oh, right, okay. How you relate energy security to energy. Okay, very simply, what is more important than energy? Food. I come from a country, Britain, which has been food dependent on imports for 400 years. The solution is basically trade. Energy interdependence works, but only if you have a diversity of potential supply sources. You don't need to be energy independent. Very nice if you are, if you've got the indigenous domestic resources and can afford to be. But one of the dangers of trying to be energy independent is that if you keep yourself a tightly closed market, you start doing something that really causes trouble down the line. You start selling energy to your own people at relatively low prices, thinking this will give a boost to your economy, an advantage. And you wind up creating a whole subsidy network. By and large, you need to think about having market prices, and trade helps you to do market prices. It's not absolute. There are plenty of cases in which subsidies are justified, but generic broad-based subsidies tend to cause generic broad-based problems. There's a question over here. Yeah.
Okay. What about the new discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean? ExxonMobil just announced a huge discovery offshore Cyprus. ENI has had several discoveries offshore Egypt. Could those constitute alternative sources to the Russian gas? I mean, there are significant
I'm having
discoveries
the same
that
problem.
are
There's a
nearby.
tremendous echo in the voice. Oh, yeah, I'm going to come to them. Yeah, yeah, I will be dealing with them. I'm going to turn now to Ukraine and the Black Sea, which will cover Romania in the next section. First of all, coming to the more specific pipeline part, the predominance is of Russian pipelines heading towards different parts of Europe. In particular, traditionally, the majority of the gas that has reached European customers, whether from Turkey, Southern Europe, or the big giant customers in Germany and Central Europe, are supplies that have transited to Ukraine. However, in the wake of several disruptions, the disputes between Ukraine and Russia in 2006, 2009, and 2013, the Russians have decided that ideally they want to have as little to do with Ukraine as possible, with the possible exception of annexing parts of it. That last policy has serious consequences. I can make a pretty fair case for saying that the cut-offs in 2006, or the reductions, the disputes, in 2006, 2009, 2013, all owe a lot to the obstreperous attitude of both Ukraine and Russia. You cannot simply put all the blame on one side or the other. But what you can do is say that there was a quantitative change when Russia invaded Crimea. And it was an invasion. I put this slide up because it shows what Ukraine potentially lost. We all know how much land around the Donetsk area has been taken by Russia or its proxy local fighters. But the siege of Crimea took something like 3/4 of Ukraine's offshore maritime resources. The point is, it's not that these resources are now recognized as being Russian. They're not. And if Russia sought to develop them, it would come under all kinds of penal sanctions for developing somebody else's property that would entitle that person to demand damages in international courts. But it does mean that the resource development in those areas is simply taken off the table. So you don't have a plus going into the Russian column, but you do have a minus going into the Ukrainian column. 4 blocks: Skifka, Pirinskaya, Vorinska, and Tevria. There's only one that is really important, and that is Prekashenska. Why? Because there was an attempt by an American company, Banco, to develop it. Would have been a technically very complex operation. They had high hopes that there were good resources there, but they were never able to achieve closure with the Ukrainian authorities for a variety of reasons, which simply serve to highlight how difficult it is to do business in Ukraine, even without thinking about the consequences of Russian intervention. But here you have what you were asking me to talk about, the offshore Romanian and Bulgarian blocks. You've got ExxonMobil at Neptune. You've got Black Sea Oil and Gas at Anna and Doina. They have what might be described as useful but not earth-shattering discoveries. They are commercially viable in a local, small-scale, regional context. Put together, if everything turned out positively, there would be a small amount for seasonal export and quite possibly a small amount for regular round-the-year export. But we're not talking of anything very great. Primarily, it simply serves to make the point that Romania would be once again, as it were, self-sufficient in gas. But go back to the other slide, which is why I put it in again. What is the far side of that boundary? Used to be Ukraine, Ukraine's EEZ. Question, whose EEZ is it now? Legally, of course, Ukraine. I wonder how much attention Russia pays to legality these days. So then we have the next phase. What are the pipelines that are going to be developed in this area that will impact either on ensuring that this area becomes better integrated within the region, or potentially can contribute to overall European energy security? First thing, Russia. Turkey Stream. Turkey Stream has a long history, but essentially, the purpose of it is very simple. One part of a dual Russian effort to bypass Ukraine. The other element being the Nord Stream project. Now, with Turk Stream, you had originally a plan for 4 pipelines across the Black Sea, each of which would carry close to 16 BCM of gas a year. When it got revived by Mr. Putin when he went to Ankara in 2014, it came in at half that size, 2 twin pipes. Well, we know what one of them is going to do. One of them is just simply a straight substitute for the gas that comes down from Ukraine through Moldova, through Romania and Bulgaria to Turkey. It was carrying about 11 BCM of gas to Turkey and maybe 14 BCM at peak. So basically a new 16 BCM pipeline is more or less a straight swap. But what's the second pipeline going to do? Because that is being built. But we'll come back to that in a minute. But it's Turk Stream at the moment, we know for sure, is almost completed as far as landfall in Turkey itself. So what kind of environment is it entering? It's entering an environment dominated by what is called the Southern Gas Corridor. And this is the 40 billion, actually now come down a bit, so even cheaper than that, system of upstream and pipeline development that includes the development of gas in Azerbaijan and 3 separate projects for the construction of pipelines, one from Azerbaijan to Turkey, one across Turkey, and one from the Turkish-Greek border to southern Italy. The point about this system is primarily it had to be developed on commercial lines. In the years before a final investment decision was taken in December 2013, there was an enormous amount of talk about how governments wanted this or that project. And in particular, there was a tremendous amount of talk about the prospects for the Nabucco project, which had the state companies of, let me get this right, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Austria as partners. But nothing came of that. And people would always say, well, that's because they didn't have the gas. That's actually a load of rubbish, because they would be competing for the gas on exactly the same terms as the other pipelines that wanted to rival them. Namely, we knew the gas, such as it was going to come from Azerbaijan. But the reason it didn't get built is very simple. It would have relied very, very, very extensively on the existing transit system across Turkey. And to put it bluntly, the Azerbaijanis did not trust the Turkish gas authorities. Why is this important? If you're a transit country and you own and operate the infrastructure, you can control in extremis where that gas goes. So let's say that your pipeline across Turkey is routinely carrying large supplies to Bulgaria or even Romania or Greece or Italy, but that Turkey has a really bad winter and desperately needs gas. If you're the Turkish state company, you'll divert the gas to Turkish customers and argue the point later. Besides which, there was also the possibility that if gas from another source, such as Russia, came in, you would give it priority in the system. So the Azerbaijanis simply decided, we don't like this, we need to cross Turkey, we will build our own pipeline. And that is essentially the TANAP pipeline. And then you have a competitive bid for the final section to Italy or to Baumgarten, and the best offer in terms of the charge for the gas going through came from the group companies that developed the TAP pipeline. So you've got here a commercial pipeline development. And why this slide is so important is because it makes clear that all of these are underpinned by gas sales. They didn't start building the system or signing the contract until they knew they had the definitive gas sales that would justify the whole project. At the time, they thought it would cost $45 billion. It looks now as if it's going to come in at slightly less than 40 billion. That's not a bad saving. So what is Russia going to do? Well, Russia's problem is it has three options, essentially, for the second 16 BCM line that comes in from the Black Sea. It can revive a project to carry it across Greece and build a new pipeline from the Ionian Sea to Italy. It can build a new pipeline reviving its South Stream project to get it out to either Baumgarten in Austria or perhaps to northwestern Italy, or it can seek to put it into the TAP system. Well, we think we know what they're going to do now. They're actually going to send it up to Baumgarten. And we know that because they signed a series of contracts, and whereas until last autumn, they were mainly talking about this wonderful phrase, memoranda of understanding, preliminary agreements with a host of countries, which don't commit you to anything. They just simply are an indication you are interested in possibly using this route, this system, or this project. But now they're moving towards the stage of contracts, putting their money where their mouth is. And the difference is that 3 or 4 years ago, we wouldn't have thought they had the money for this, because nobody else is going to pay for these lines to be built. Now we think, because their sales to Europe are up, prices have recovered a little bit. They're getting the surplus income that they can to build the pipelines. So what is the indigenous regional response to all this? Surely this just simply means that with Russia having the ability to develop these big pipelines, Europe is going to become ever more dependent on Russian gas. That's why the European Union put money into the Southern Gas Corridor, primarily in the form of loans from organizations like the EIB and the EBRD. It's why there's grant aid going to Brewer. It's why they're looking at developing things like the Ionian Adriatic pipeline. But, and it's a very big but, what is the scope of Brewer? And what is its likely success going to be? It's a limited capacity line. When you talk of Russian pipelines, they talk commonly of 30, 33 BCM systems. When you talk of the Southern Gas Corridor, it's a system that is designed to carry at least 20 BCM. Brewer is designed to carry 4.4 BCM. It's a modest and useful contribution, but no one can say it solves the energy security problem. And what is the energy security problem? Basically, it's a very simple one. Where do you get your gas from if for some reason, which could be a natural disaster, it could be anything, your chief supplier cannot supply you? Brewer does not enable you to carry anything like the amount necessary. You need a bigger pipeline as an insurance policy. And this is the point I'm really going to make. You don't need a whole set of giant new 20, 30 BCM pipelines across Europe that are going to cost an absolute fortune to build. But a lot of Europe's proposed funding to help pipelines would go a lot further if they insisted that there was an energy security component that increased the size of pipelines that are being developed for essentially commercial priorities, so that they can also play a useful role in energy security. Because it doesn't cost that much to increase in this case to double the size of the capacity of a pipeline like Brewer. What it requires is either a slightly larger diameter pipe or a slightly tougher pipe and spare capacity in the form of extra compression as and when it's needed. You're not reinventing the wheel and buying an expensive product. But Brewer has another problem. Is it actually going to do even its original purpose, which is to connect Bulgaria with the bulk of the new line, bulk of the system being in Romania, to both Hungary and Austria? Well, the Hungarians are supposed to be cooperating, but are they in practice? Seems very doubtful indeed. And if you can't get through Hungary, how do you get to Baumgarten and the actual great big European hub? The Hungarians have suggested, well, actually, it'd be far more sensible not to use the congested link between Hungary and Austria, but send it up via Slovakia. It makes some sense, but it will cost a bit more money to do all the connections. And basically, they're saying it because I think they're simply trying to throw a spanner in the works. And if you don't get that connection at the far end, then what is the point of connecting the Brewer system up with the offshore fields? Indeed, what is the purpose of the offshore fields unless you simply want to take a small amount or a minimal amount from them just simply for purely domestic use? That would still make sense. But it basically returns Romania to being what it sought to be in Soviet days, an independent energy island. As for Turk Stream, it will proceed apace, aided by Hungary. This is the slide that Commerson came up with in November, which is the best basic description of what Turk Stream is doing. So before I go on to Turkish issues, and I've got 3 sections, Turkish issues, Caspian issues, and East Med. Have you got questions? No? Yes, over there.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you can touch upon Agri a bit. I don't know if this falls under Caspian issues, but maybe you can discuss a bit if Agri is still a viable alternative for bringing gas from Azerbaijan over the Black Sea using the LNG terminal in Constanța. Thank you.
I'm going to come on to the Caspian, but I'll take your question right now because I haven't thought to address it before in this context. Nobody has yet built an LNG terminal in a foreign country. Sorry, no gas producer has yet built an LNG terminal in a foreign country. The nearest example we have is the prospective use by Cyprus of LNG terminals in Egypt. But that's because those terminals are already built and are in fact, or until recently, were underutilized. Indeed, they were closed or mothballed completely. Why would you want to take the risk of building what would be a multi-billion-dollar project on the Georgian coast and then ship it as LNG across to Romania? Because you can't ship it through, well, You might have problems if you tried to ship it through the Turkish Straits, because the Turkish government would not be happy. If you want to look into the whole question of the Bosphorus, I'm happy to do so, because legally you would be entitled to send an LNG terminal through the Straits. I bet the Turks would find a way to stop you, though. So I don't think LNG for Azerbaijan is a practical option. One tiny possible option, but I don't think they will opt for it, would be a small-scale compressed natural gas plant on the Georgian coast, because those need relatively small footprints, but they only carry small amounts of volume anyway. But that might just conceivably make commercial sense for Black Sea traffic. But basically LNG, no. I put in Turkey because Turkey plays such a crucial role in energy transit. Now, in practice, I've used similar slides to this in the last 2 or 3 years because I was really worried about the state of security in Turkey. I have the same worries, but at the same time, I've got to admit, my worst fears were not realized. Doesn't matter whether you agree or you disagree with Mr. Erdogan's policies. Most of his country remains more or less at peace. But I'll go further into this. And I'll do it by... In July 2015, the 2.5-year truce between Turkey and the PKK in the south came to an end. There are various reasons as to why it happened. My own simple statement is that it actually suited both sides at the time to end it. But the result of that was, within the next 5 weeks, there were a string of attacks on energy installations. 4 on pipelines and 1 on a train carrying pipe for the construction of the gas line. Energy is simply a logical target if the situation is bad. It's not a deliberate move that says we must target energy because we are against the energy flowing or whatever. It's just simply a relatively easy target to hit. So my concerns with Turkey are not that the Turkish government or the PKK or terrorists of whatever kind are out to stop the flow of energy. It is that if the situation in Turkey were to deteriorate in general, energy installations would prove a very tempting target. What do I mean by this? Turkey is still at war. Its officers, Chief Air Force Commander, has defined the war with the PKK in southeastern Turkey as a war. 4,800 people at least have been killed by independent estimates. Turkish sources say that they've killed 10,000 militants. Whatever happens, this is a high casualty conflict. And why it is so dangerous is that I come from a country that has fought a war with people that we would consider and called terrorists, the IRA. But at the same time as we were engaged in a very vicious, nasty war with government forces doing some rather unpleasant things. The government, through different channels, was also reaching out to the political wing of the armed fighters, the political party known as Sinn Féin. The problem with Turkey is that there's no such attempt at outreach to non-Kurdish militants. And the other problem is that whereas in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, the war was confined to the southeast and still to a large extent is, more Kurds now live in Istanbul, Izmir, Ankara, the big cities, or at least as many do, as live in the southeast. At the moment, it seems quite clear from a Turkish government perspective that the situation is under control. My concern is what happens if it is not. And it's not, as I'm saying, that energy would be the reason for attacks on energy installations. It's just it would be a natural consequence of a deteriorating situation. So all I'm really saying to you is, keep your eye on Turkey and on its question between how the government responds and how the PKK and how other terrorist groups act in Turkey. It is still a delicate situation. Then we come to the Caspian. Now, the Caspian's got lots of lovely, beautiful, fantastic resources. But how to get them? We've got the Southern Gas Corridor, but the contracts that underpin the Southern Gas Corridor were signed in December 2013, when energy prices were high. Would anybody build, would anybody be prepared to invest the 40-odd billion it would cost these days? That's questionable. But there's still scope for more. Now, I've put in optimism and reality. Reality probably indicates that more gas will come on stream from Azerbaijan, but at a much slower pace than originally envisaged. And the reason for that is that much of the infrastructure is there already, and I don't just mean the physical infrastructure, but the commercial, the legal infrastructure to improve sales further along. This is not so of other prospective suppliers. And there are dreams. If you want the ultimate dream, there's a project called White Stream that would seek to lay a pipeline under the Black Sea. Fine, but who's going to pay for it? Where's the gas going to come from? And here you come to the real problem. There is a mound of gas on the other side of the Caspian in Turkmenistan. But can it be accessed? Can it be enticed to enter the European market? This is a list of all the prospective, or no, nearly all the prospective sources for what one might call the expansion of the Southern Gas Corridor. Southern Gas Corridor is a system that can carry 20 BCM. 10 BCM is already signed for and will come from Azerbaijan. Where will the next 10 BCM come from? In theory, in terms of capacity, you could start putting out extra gas in from the early 20s. It would only take you 18 months of advance notice to put in the extra compression. Theory is a wonderful thing, though. The real problem is that the pace of Azerbaijani production is going to be slow. And then there's the real question, can you access Turkmenistan? Turkmenistan is the world's fourth largest holder of confirmed gas reserves. At Galkanish, it has the world's biggest onshore gas field, with something like, God, I'm just trying to remember the figures, 26 point, I put it down here so I would remember. Yeah, there we are. It's got up to 26.2 trillion cubic meters of gas. If I tell you that the entire current advance estimate of Azerbaijani gas reserves is 2 trillion cubic meters, to have a field that may contain as much as 26 trillion cubic meters shows the scale of difference. There are several problems. We don't know how fast actual development of Galkanish is proceeding, although in theory it's been going underway for nearly 10 years. But more to the point, you're up against the problem of Turkmen reluctance, indeed refusal, to do anything other than sell the gas at their border. How did Azerbaijan manage to get its gas into the European market? By selling it to final customers in Italy and by taking shares in the infrastructure companies that would develop the infrastructure to carry that gas to Italy. 57% of the shareholding, I think it is, in the TANAP project, 20% of the shareholding in the TAP project. The Azerbaijanis reached out in all sorts of directions to get their gas into markets. Turkmens have not found it possible to do that. I think it has to possibly simply be a feeling of cultural nervousness about operating in external environments that they do not necessarily understand and fear that they would be taken advantage of. But there are some solutions that can help. If you look here, the big, long, red field is Block 1. That's operated by a Malaysian company, Petronas Karagali. It's on the Turkmen side, firmly in Turkmen waters. And as with so many Caspian fields, they went looking for oil and they basically found they got gas. Turkmenistan's got more gas than it knows what to do with, so what's the point of having it? You can sell it to the state for pennies, which may or may not sell it on to Iran. What you can't do is monetize it in any normal Western commercial mode, unless you can get it to the other side of the Caspian, the Azerbaijani side, and put it in the pipeline and set it off for European buyers. Well, Petronas is clearly aiming to do something like this. It's actually bought a stake in the counterpart field in Azerbaijan, Shah Deniz. There have been quite intensive discussions on linking the production platforms at Block 1 with the distribution systems that serve the oil field next door in Azerbaijan at ACG, less than 100 kilometers away. Straightforward, plug it into our ACG, use the ACG network, which produces some gas as well, to filter it through to the main receiving terminals at Sangachal, and then put it in the pipeline. Problem, it's too good to be true, because Turkmenistan has a very simple rule that says, before you export any gas, it must be processed in Turkmenistan rather than processed outside Turkmenistan. So you must take the gas from the middle of the Caspian, bring it back to the Turkmen shore, process it, and then transport it back across the Caspian. 1.5 crossings of the Caspian instead of a half crossing. As an example of how to forfeit potential revenue from an obvious win-win project, that is hard to beat. There is a problem too with Caspian boundaries. There were the agreements reached last year that more or less settled them, but it didn't really settle the issue of just where the boundaries might lie precisely, merely the principles on which you would determine them, and it didn't solve a thorn in the flesh of both Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, a small field right bang in the middle, almost certainly lying vast majority in Turkmen waters, but possibly a bit might just be jutting into Azerbaijani waters, called by the Turkmen Serda and by the Azerbaijanis Kyapaz. That island, that isolated field, has managed to thwart the best intentions of developers on both sides. So nothing's happened. And overlaying all of this, scarcely touched upon, the pounding might of China. The One Belt, One Road initiative. Are we seeing some vast new neo-colonial approach, state-backed industry, enterprise, forcing its way into markets and making those markets dependent on China? I think to a certain extent, yes. Take a look at the amount of debt that the countries owe, the terms of debt, the Chinese willingness to appropriate assets in those countries in lieu of debt. And that, to me, is neocolonialism. You make an offer that seems too good to resist, and after 3 or 4 years, you're in very deep financial trouble when it comes to repayments. Classic example of this is Sri Lanka. But the result is you see China gaining leases to ports and physical facilities in key areas around the world. Pakistan, possibly now in Africa, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. It's a practical use of power, practical extension of power, successful. Don't mock it. They're serious. And you can argue that with the withdrawal of Trump's America from so much engagement with the rest of the world, they're potentially simply filling a vacuum. Who can blame them? And into that vacuum are sucked. Much of Central Asia, possibly Caspian states becoming increasingly dependent on trade with China, and indeed some European countries. So I'll stop there for the moment. I'll just do a bit more in the East Mediterranean afterwards, but if you want to talk, any questions at this stage? Yes, 2 questions down here. Theodore.
So it's might be a comment than a question regarding the processing gas. That because always I was a little bit pissed off when a former president of the United States said that Romania must be the hub of security of the region. Okay, it's right, but first of all, we have to cover our needs, and we have to rebuild our processing industry. We used to have a tremendous processing industry. We lost all the markets in fertilizers. So still there are some capabilities. So that is my comment, adapted to Romania. Thank you.
I have refrained from using the most controversial word of all, hub. Every country in this area wants to be a hub. Very few actually take seriously what it means. There is relatively little difficulty in simply being a hub in the form of being a place where gas comes in and gas goes out or crosses. There's a lot of questions if you really want to be a market hub, the kind of place where people want to buy and sell gas. Officially, Turkey reformed its gas industry in 2004 with the aim of becoming a commercial market hub. Nearly 15 years later, very little progress has been done to implement those reforms. And nobody thinks of Turkey likely becoming a trading hub. Greece might become a trading hub like Baumgarten. I don't think that Bulgaria will. Romania could, but it is going to have to be a lot more transparent in things like prices, and it's got to have to be a lot more open in terms of allowing gas in and out of the country. As a simple crossroads, yes, of course it could be a hub. But as a market hub, it's got a long way to go.
I had 2 questions for you. One relates to the first section on Europe and your upcoming section on Eastern Mediterranean. Do you think the gas, and also to what the gentleman over there asked, do you think that the recent discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean can provide the serious alternative to Europe, to Russian gas? You know, with all the latest discoveries of ExxonMobil in Cyprus, now the biggest ever discovery. That's question number 1. And the second question relates to the Romanian part that you talked about. You said in your presentation that Romania will be a modest gas exporter with 4.4 BCM brew-up pipeline capacity for export. But I'm wondering, with the competition, potential competition from the Eastern Mediterranean and also from the Turkish Stream second line extension to Europe, is it possible, or how worried should we be in Romania that even this modest export gas contribution can be squeezed out of the market?
I'll come on to the Eastern Mediterranean in just a minute, but in terms of the competition to brewer from Turkish Stream, I don't fundamentally think that they're in particular competition, because brewer doesn't really offer anything like the scale that any Russian development onwards from Turkey to Europe will offer. After all, essentially, a Russian pipeline going up to Baumgarten is likely to be 3 times the size of Brewer in terms of capacity. So I think that's really the most important answer. But I'll deal with the Eastern Med and whether it's going to be a rival. Lots of blocks, lots of interest. Why? Because these are available for commercial exploitation. And we now are beginning to think that there are ways that if you discover gas there, you can bring it to market. Remember, there's no point in finding gas if you can't get it to market. This is maybe one of the problems about finding small fields like Ana and Dina of Romania. Lots of blocks and lots of interest and lots of discoveries. Theoretical export options abound, but they're theoretical. You can't really think of getting a pipeline up to Turkey because although legally you're perfectly entitled to build a pipeline through somebody else's exclusive economic zone, in practice they can hold it up for a length of time. And since any such pipeline would have to go through Cypriot waters, the government of Cyprus is not likely to agree to it or to cooperate in the construction of such a line unless there was already real progress towards a settlement of the, 45-year-old Cyprus problem. So can you bring the gas by pipeline to Europe? At this stage, and I'm fairly careful about words, I think not. The project would have to entail a pipeline going at depths of up to 3,000 meters, deeper than it's ever been done. I don't doubt that they can do it technically, but it imposes limitations. One of the limitations it imposes is that you could probably only lay a pipeline capable of carrying about 10 BCM. So 10 BCM over basically 1,500 kilometers of subsea with small land crossings, that's a lot of money for a relatively limited amount. Water depths. And then you've got problems. Well, I'll deal with these coming up. I'm going to come back to the Lebanon maritime one. Look at this. The first thing here is that the production fields in Cyprus are contested. It's extraordinarily difficult to work out on what conceivable grounds either Turkey or indeed the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus claim these particular exclusive economic zones. There's no rational way that one can work it out. Nonetheless, they do. But the key point is, it looks as if, frankly, the Western companies, by and large, are ignoring any claims Turkey might make in the area and remain content to drill in areas licensed by the Cypriot government. But do note the cluster of fields at the bottom, because these include Zor, giant field with 30 trillion cubic feet of gas, that's about 850 BCM of gas. So one field has got close to half the volume of Azerbaijan total. You've got much smaller fields, Aphrodite, smaller discoveries, Calypso, 2 weeks ago, the Glokos discovery. The problem for Cyprus is none of these are big. They're modest. Tie them together and they'd be useful for the gasification of Cyprus, but they need one really big discovery to justify thinking about developing an LNG project themselves. So in the meantime, what do? They do what everybody's doing, including Israel, which has got two really decent-sized fields, Leviathan and Tamar. You take your gas to Egypt by a combination of new and existing pipelines, and you use the otherwise idle LNG facilities at Idku and Damietta on the Nile Delta to export the gas. The reason they were idle is that they were developed when Egypt was a gas exporter, but then Egypt started consuming so much gas, not least because it was available so cheaply on the domestic market, it no longer had any gas to export. Now it's suddenly made new discoveries, and the pipelines can come, and the LNG facilities can come back into use again. But there's another reason why you have pipeline problems, why you have it. This is a more substantial one. Where is there a contiguous line between the EEZ of Greece and the EEZ of Cyprus? Or is there a connection point between the EEZ of Turkey and the EEZ of Egypt? I've looked at this problem fairly carefully, and I would say, on the whole, the balance favors Turkey. The only thing, of course, is Turkey rejects the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which would be the principal legal argument in favor of defining Turkey as having an EEZ that extended to Egypt. And there's a reason, though, why I think this issue will not boil over. Although the maps I showed you before set out what we think the governments of Athens and Ankara actually believe they should have. And although they have sent documents, their foreign ministers sent documents like this to the United Nations arguing the case, they've never actually sought to make formal public claims along these lines, because they don't want to open up a real can of worms, which is the Aegean, where they really have visceral disputes over the extent of maritime sea limits. They've managed to put these issues to one side and to continue to developing in the region, including a lot of local trade that exists now that didn't exist 20 years ago. And they don't want to jeopardize that by starting to have a public row over ownership of offshore waters. So I'll come to my conclusion, and then we can have some questions. This is a tough neighborhood, and it has a particularly tough neighbor. Until the early 21st century, Russia simply acted as an overt public bully, took advantage of its monopolistic power to use energy in a bullying way. 50 incidents, mainly concerning the Baltics, until about 2005, 2006. They've been more sophisticated in the last 10 or 12 years. You have a number of energy-related attacks, and some of these have been quite serious. explosions in the Caucasus, cut-off of electricity supplies to Georgia are amongst the earliest examples. A very, very peculiar incident on the 5th and 6th of August 2008, when the BTC oil pipeline was ruptured by a massive explosion. At the time, Turkish authorities said this was the fault of the PKK. Everything that I was told when I tried to investigate the incident led me to believe it was something far more sophisticated. And above all, the timing. It happened basically around 36 hours before the crisis in Georgia erupted into full-scale war. If it had not happened when war broke out on the 7th, the immediate reaction amongst Western nations would have been that the entry of Russian armed forces that went as far as Joseph Stalin's town of Gori would have been an effort that would have been, people would have said, in part aimed at cutting the Western energy lifeline from Azerbaijan. But because the line was already out of action and the markets had already reacted, there was no such attitude, no such reaction. Energy was almost the dog that didn't bark during the Georgian War. Many years later, reporters in the Wall Street Journal managed to dig out some interesting material that showed that all the cameras on the BTC valve station went out simultaneously, just before, 3 days before the operation, before the damage, except for one infrared camera that was not connected to the main system. And what did that show? Figures dressed in what were described as frogman kit, i.e. completely covered. And what were they armed with? Laptop computers. I think what we saw there was a Spetsnaz operation that took out the pipeline before the war began. And if you want the final example of how Russia plays tough on energy, turn to Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan secures a very good deal with Russia in 2009. It will get more or less global prices for the gas that it sells to Russia, that Russia then delivers to Ukraine and to other countries. Fantastic. At the time, it's exporting around 45 BCM of gas a year to Russia. After a while, the Russians realized they're actually paying an awful lot of money to Turkmenistan for this gas. So they want to cut it. And what do? They issue an ultimatum. They say, we are going to close the pipeline that receives gas at the Turkmen-Uzbek border, and you've got 12 hours to cut off the supply. Turkmens respond by saying, for God's sake, give us time. You can't go cutting off gas just like that. It's going to take us 3 days. We'll do it, but give us time. And the Russians say, nope. And about 15 hours later or so, I can't remember when, the line simply explodes because of the pressure in it. In that time, the Turkmens have cut off something like 80–85% of the input. They've done bloody well, but they pay the price. They lose the exports to Russia, they have an explosion on their hands, and it's a completely man-made explosion as a result of a Russian démarche. This is very tough energy politics indeed. And when the Turkmens finally do get a contract back with Russia, it's not covering 30 or 40 BCM, it's covering up to 30 BCM, and the up to, in fact, stalls at about 10 or 11 BCM. So finally, tough project, tough or soft approach, you build more pipelines. Build Turk Stream in the south, you build Nord Stream in the north. You agree with the European Union that once the gas reaches Europe, it'll be subject to EU rules, but you insist that it's your gas that goes into the system, and in the end, it would look as if the Europeans have agreed, and no matter how much the Americans might want to put sanctions on companies involved with Nord Stream, doesn't seem to stop the pipeline being built in practice. Complaints from Poland and Ukraine get ignored, more or less, and the result of that will be that from a year or two from now, Russian requirement to use Ukraine will not be totally, absolutely removed. Probably about 10 or 15 BCM will still need to transit for another 2 or 3 years, but eventually even that will go. So Russia basically freezes out Ukraine and costs Ukraine 2 to 3 billion a year in transit revenues. So coming to the end, what do we say? Well, I don't really see Turkmen gas challenging Russia in European markets. I wish it would. I don't think it's going to in practice. What we might see is a limited supply going to Azerbaijan. And there you have a point that I haven't mentioned before. Because the Shah Deniz field is operated by foreign companies, although the state oil company has a big stake in it, its entire output is already committed to foreign buyers. So paradoxically, Azerbaijan is becoming a major gas exporter, but is suffering potentially from shortages of gas supply at home. So therefore, it would be quite useful to have a modest supply coming over from Turkmenistan. Iran, no real prospect. Iraq, haven't mentioned it, but that was a project that was big 3 or 4 years ago and now looks dead. East Med will be big, but it's LNG from Egypt, far more flexible. So conclusion, what can we do to cover ourselves against Russia? Well, one of the things is the more LNG that arrives in Europe, the more it makes for price competition across Europe. In almost all markets, with the exception of isolated areas of southeastern Europe, Russian gas has to be sold at a competitive price. Now, do remember, Russia can be flexible on competitive pricing. It can undercut anybody else if it wants to. What it can't do anymore is monopolize and dominate the market and set its own prices. But the biggest thing, I think, here is flexible pipeline structures within Europe. We've gone a long way. We have a multiplicity of LNG receiving terminals throughout Europe. And if you want to know one example of just quickly how effective they can be, as soon as Lithuania announced it was going to develop a floating regasification and storage unit to bring in LNG. Gazprom cut the price of gas to Lithuania by more than 20%. In effect, the savings on the Gazprom gas that was imported paid for the Lithuanian terminal within 2 years. Flexibility works. But you need better pipelines within Europe so that gas from one part can reach other parts. And that's basically the core of the 3 Cs initiative in as much as it concerns gas. Make sure that, as it were, any gas that's landed in Romania can reach Central Europe. Make sure that any gas that's landed in the Baltic at the LNG terminals in Poland can reach Central Europe. Make sure that any gas landed at the proposed new LNG terminal at Kirk Island in Croatia can reach Central Europe. Create flexibility. If you do that, you're pretty much there. And what's the last thing that I would add? This is the very last slide. Europe has talked about developing a north-south corridor, little bits of it in place. We need to do better on integrated thinking. We really do need to develop a proper set of connections that link the Baltic and the Adriatic. Oh yes, and when I did this paper back in 2016, you'll see there is the squiggle, the S-shaped line or whatever, that goes from Swinouska in the north to Kirk Island in the south. But there's also a line that goes off to the east. That's Brewer. But it needs to be built bigger than is planned. Thank you.
We have about, thank you, John Roberts, for this wonderful presentation. I think we have about 15 minutes of question and answers, because we, set as a limit 7 o'clock. So I'd encourage all of you. Oh, there are questions over there.
Thank you for your presentation. From the entire discussion here, and also from what I read, I understand that on the medium term, there's no real alternative to the Russian gas in terms of capacity, the prices they offer, where it can come from, etc. And you now were saying about flexibility as a solution. Do you have maybe some updates on the developments regarding the willingness of the companies to invest in flexibility? Because it's not talked about, to a certain extent there is discussion about this flexibility that we need inside Europe, but the money in the end comes from the companies, doesn't come from the European Union itself. So is there any willingness, major projects in developing this internal flexibility? Thank you.
If I get the question right, and please, Gina, correct me if I've got it wrong, you're saying what are the major internal projects that would promote flexibility? And I think the first thing is I would opt for the Ionian Adriatic pipeline, because that would enable gas from Azerbaijan carried through the southern gas, or from anywhere else carried through the southern gas corridor, to access not big but useful markets in the southwestern Balkans. And if it was built at a reasonable capacity, could be extended up to connect with the proper Croatian system in the north of Croatia, and thus form part of a structure that would reach Central Europe in emergency. Other elements that are missing, we're going to see a new interconnector between Greece and Macedonia, And developing that line up north into Serbia would be good. Again, the Albanian authorities have ideas, the Albanian Gas Authority, for connecting Albania and the TAP system through to Kosovo. But with all of these, we're talking of small-scale projects, which are, how do I phrase this? They're marginal cases when it comes to commercialities. Really, a lot will depend on whether they actually develop the markets that they connect up. Somehow we need to find something that is a little bit bigger. We don't need things like the vertical gas corridor that was proposed as or East String, proposed as a giant 40 BCM system. Who's going to build a 40 BCM system from Greece to Hungary? Where's the gas going to come from? Theoretically, yes, it could come via Turk Stream and Russia, etc. That would be fine. But who's going to build it? And if you've got a Russian South Stream going through Bulgaria and Serbia up to Hungary, you've more or less done most of that anyway. So I tend to think the European Commission is on the right track with its projects of common interest and its focus on interconnectors. I just wish there was a bit more strategic thinking about putting them together to make a whole, rather than just relying on what two countries think, because you really need something that corresponds more to a system than just a connection.
Good evening. I would like to ask a question about the Turkmen gas pipeline to Europe. You said that it is kind of impossible because of the Turkmen authorities' reluctance to open up, I don't know how to say it, to open up to the European market. But maybe it's because of the fear of the Russians, because as I read some articles, and by the way, I'm from Turkmenistan, that there is a big arm race in that territory, in the Caspian Sea, that Turkmenistan is actually afraid of Russia. And you gave an example in 2009 when there was conflict between Turkmenistan and Russia when the pipeline exploded. Maybe you did a little mistake there. Maybe it's not about the not readiness of this country, but about their fear to against Russians.
The Turkmens have what I would describe as a very ambivalent relationship with Russia. Like most of the Central Asian states, they are worried about the danger. They worry about the dangers of Islamic fundamentalism. They regard Russian protection, Russian assistance, as being very important in keeping that, what they consider to be a genuine threat, at bay. That means they have cooperation between their security forces, but it also means that they don't really know how to respond when they have essentially commercial disputes with Russia over gas. And because they don't have sufficient alternatives, what has happened is that reliance on Russia has been replaced with reliance on China. They have almost totally ceased exports to Iran. Some gas goes to Iran, but I think that's a complicated swap arrangement that may involve Azerbaijan as well. But we're only talking 1 or 2 BCM. They really are out of the loop in terms of being an island that is incredibly rich in terms of its gas resource base, and yet finds it an inability to access the major commercial markets of the world. And if it could only access one of those commercial markets, it would be able to get a better deal from the customers it already has. I'm regrettably pessimistic about Turkmenistan because I don't think that they have worked out a way to change their focus from this giant project to build a pipeline across Afghanistan to Pakistan and India and focus on something that is more capable of actual delivery. At the moment, everything is focused on a very sensible commercial prospect. You know, of course, if you're Turkmenistan, you look at India and Pakistan, great markets, send your gas there. But you physically can't do it so long as there is civil war in Afghanistan. And that is something I don't think they've really come to terms with. So, I have a question here. Yeah.
I'm Teodora Cimpoi from News Energy. And I would like to ask you, how do you see, with your analyst view, the latest changes in Romania regarding BRUA? And I mean that the national operator Transgaz and the Hungarian operator didn't succeed to book the capacity for the second phase at 4.5 billion cubic meters. Also, we have big problems in the Black Sea, where Exxon put on hold the final investment decision. How do you see all this situation which is getting worse in Romania? And who's gonna gain from this situation? This is the first question, please. And the second would be...
Can I do it first, and then I'll come back to you?
Okay, thanks.
Unfortunately, they're very good questions. The most important thing is that I think that with regard to the phase 2 question and the question of investment in phase 2, which is the sort of connection up towards the Hungarian border, that really is a very poor reflection on the attitudes and actions of the Hungarian authorities in effect making it clear they are not cooperating in BRUA, although officially they're supposed to cooperate in BRUA. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I have friends of mine who've worked on the Hungarian energy side, and they say they're absolutely insistent that these problems will be resolved, but they're not. So that's the Hungarian element. The Black Sea element is, I think, still far more an internal Romanian problem concerning lack of predictability over taxation, lack of predictability over the regulations governing energy exploration, development, and how it proceeds, as well as, partly due to the Hungarians, concerns about where the gas is going to go. Because if, as I understand it, what Black Sea gas does initially is it balances Romania's internal books in terms of gas. But to do that, you would probably want some seasonal exports and some seasonal imports. And BRUA is quite important in that regard. And in the long run, of course, you're hoping that successful initial discoveries are followed by further discoveries which can be plugged into an existing system and be used simply for export and to make money. So in that sense, ExxonMobil putting the FID on hold, and indeed Black Sea Oil and Gas in practice putting its FID on hold, pending further clarifications about taxation and regulations, from their perspective is quite understandable. I don't know what the answer is in terms of whether there is a prospect that the Romanian government will look at changing or adapting the regulations. But I do understand, if you are a Western investor, are you interested? And if I'll give you one example of how I think ExxonMobil is thinking at the moment. At Greece, a week ago, there was an ExxonMobil official talking about developments in this area, and he more or less mentioned two things en passant, just showing them up, saying we're here, and then moving on. One was offshore Romania, the other was offshore Cyprus, where they just made their Glaucus discovery. Now, the second one was almost certainly because he didn't want to get involved in a political argument. But what he focused on was offshore Crete, off Greece. And he spent 2 or 3 minutes talking about it, simply because it's a vast area that has never been looked at before. Nobody knows if there's anything there, but he's got the rights, they've got the rights to it. That tells me something about how low in their priorities ExxonMobil, Black Sea offshore Romania is. If you're a big company, you've got lots of other opportunities. And some you win, and some you put a bit of money in, and then you lose. Sorry, second question.
Thank you. Yes. The second question is, how serious do you see the scenario of a total or a large military intervention of Russia in Ukraine after Gazprom will succeed to bypass totally Ukraine, when Turkish Stream and Nord Stream will be fully operational? And what is going to happen in the region in the next year when the transit contract between Ukraine and Gazprom will be finished?
I'll take the easier part of the question at the end to start with. Gazprom relations can be managed, not least because of European Union backing, so long as Ukraine is seen to be gradually increasing the levels of transparency in its gas operations. So I'm not too worried about, yes, Ukraine's going to suffer because the volume of gas is going to go down, but I think it just has to put up with that. There's no, it doesn't have a God-given right to receive gas from Russia. But in terms of invasion, in terms of military action, I doubt Russia is going to mount another push in the way that we saw the separatists, or whatever you want to call them, or the Russian aid, trying to push to Mariupol 3 or 4 years ago. But I don't think we're going to see peace. I don't think we're going to see an end to the bouts of fighting that continue along that front. I just don't think they particularly want to push it. I think it's far more convenient for Russia, for the Donetsk area to continue to be a real irritant for the Ukrainians, which they can do without mounting a major operation which would bring down, or which might bring down real wrath from Western states. I'm not sure that's completely answered your question, but I hope it's somewhere along it.
I'd like to thank you for putting into perspective the size of the projects in Romania, because in the media in Romania there have been vehiculated all sorts of numbers, and this project is treated as something of a humongous scale, which it actually is not. You've seen even positions, people starting to ask themselves what we are going to do with that much gas and that much money that will flow on us. And there is a lot of lack of understanding of how this industry actually works and what volumes they are talking about. The fact that you discovered gas in the ground, it doesn't mean that you can technically and economically can produce it. So there is no discussion about the high risks and large uncertainties when it comes to estimating resources and reserves.
I've missed the point. I've completely, because there's an echo in the voice through the microphone. Which high risks are you suggesting?
Probably talk without the microphone.
Yeah.
There's a high uncertainty in the process of estimating resources and reserves. And when the media writes about these topics, they usually consider these things as being there for sure. They talk about billions and billions of cubic meters as if they are for sure in the ground and they are for sure recoverable. Nobody talks about the uncertainties associated with these estimates and the fact that these volumes can vary widely. You see numbers vehiculated in the Romanian media of hundreds of billions of cubic meters, but they don't associate any probability with those numbers. And as you know, the oil industry works with a probabilistic approach to estimate these resources, and that means you have a 10% probability to have this volume, or a 90% probability to have that volume. So this huge range. Yeah? So nobody talks about this. They say we have this much in the ground and they take it for sure that it's there. In the Black Sea, what I can say, nobody knows how much is there. We've seen some estimates, but nobody talks about how, what's the probability. The question is, how do you see this aspect? I mean, we talk about this building the pipelines for these volumes, the capacity, but at the producer end, there is a high uncertainty related to these volumes. Yeah, we build a pipeline for 5 BCM, but do we know how much we really have, how much will be technically and economically recoverable?
I think I make a very general point. With the exception of Russia itself, I don't really see a future for really big pipelines anymore. The exception will continue to be Russia will develop the Power of Siberia pipeline to China. But Turkmenistan has a very serious question. It had prospects to develop new export systems and didn't take advantage of them when times were ripe, i.e. in eras of relatively high prices. Prices are now far more competitive. LNG is far more prevalent and acts as a damper on prices right round the world. So Turkmenistan is in an extraordinarily difficult position. And we know that a whole economic structure within the country is having to be changed as limits on government spending force it to end subsidies for a wide range of commodities within the country. I don't see Turkmenistan having the capital available to develop big projects on its own, and I doubt that it has the capacity to develop the kind of partnerships required to get Western investment, not Western, international investment into the country, because that would almost certainly require them to think of opening up their onshore resources to things like production sharing agreements. Okay. I'm not going to answer it. I'm not going to answer it. I told you I'm not going to. Brexit. In 1 hour and 45 minutes, the UK Parliament, UK House of Commons, will start, MPs will get up from their seats and they will start moving towards the lobbies for the most important vote that Parliament has taken since the Second World War. And astonishingly, we are not sure what the outcome will be. We could have a narrow majority for the government and for its policy that would require the UK to leave the European Union in, let me get this right, 17 days' time. Or it could be defeated. And if it's defeated, we have no idea. We know what's going to happen the next day or two if it's defeated, but we have no idea what happens in the long term. My own guess is that the government will be defeated. I would have been pretty firm yesterday that it was definitely going to be defeated, and then suddenly Mrs. May goes off to Strasbourg and she comes back with a set of some kind of verbal changes to her agreement that should be able to that she hopes will be able to satisfy the rebels in her own party. But there's something far more fundamental about what's happening. Mrs. May adopted two very strict approaches to the whole issue, which I think were wrong. The first was that she believed that because she had put together a parliamentary majority, her own Conservative Party and 10 members of Parliament from Northern Ireland, that majority would deliver her the support she needed to put Brexit through. The second is that when she discovered that both a large number of her own MPs and the Northern Ireland MPs actually didn't like her plan and were prepared to vote against it, she did not, until the very last moment, make any attempt to reach out to other parties in the House of Commons. On an issue confronting and determining the future of everybody in Britain, she treated it, the whole issue, as an internal Conservative Party dispute. And essentially, this is how it began, and this is how it continues to this day. And I have no idea how the Conservative Party will remain united tonight or split tonight. There may be some Labour MPs who will join with the government. I'm sure there will be. I don't know how many. I doubt it will be enough to match those who remain bitterly opposed in her own ranks. But that's political arithmetic of a kind we have never had to calculate before. What we are seeing is a very, very deep set of divisions in Britain. And it's not just a party division. Far more, it's a division of age. There are massive, overwhelming majorities to remain in the European Union for anybody under the age of 30. There are substantial majorities for those under the age of 40. But for over 40, you start getting majorities in favour of leave, amongst the pensioners very strongly. It's a very strange situation. Do we owe loyalty to the people who put their money into the government and are afraid and want it back? Do we take into account the complete contradictions between fears of me and my generation and my type, that we're going to suffer a real serious economic problems if we leave the EU and personal incomes were affected? Or do we look at it in a completely different way and say, those people who voted to leave knew that they might be taking a risk with their own pensions, with their own lives, with their own welfare, well-being. But they've been treated so badly by government of all kinds that they just wanted to basically launch a protest because government had failed them. So why should they believe government when it said it should stay within the EU? We have a very, very divided Britain. That's not going to go away, whatever the result of the vote tonight.
Well, I think we can conclude on that note. And allow me to thank you once again on behalf of Romania Energy Center for being here with us, for sharing your expertise with us, to thank all of you for coming and staying until the end. And I would ask you to put your hands together one more time to thank you, to thank our guest speaker, John Roberts, for being here today.